Lisa Ekman, welcome to the Brian Escow Show.
Thank you so much for having me. It is my pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining me. So, you are another former Democrat just like me who had some sort of epiphany and now, I guess, voted for Trump or consider yourself a Republican or don't identify with the left anymore. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. I could say I did, in fact, vote for Trump in 2024, and I will vote for the candidate I believe will best protect our constitutional rights, and we can talk about that more, obviously. But I actually consider myself kind of politically homeless at the moment, which I think a lot of people sort of do. But I would say that it would be a really, really heavy lift for the Democrats to get my vote anytime in the near future. And that I definitely had an awakening. Some might call it a red pill moment, but I would say I had an awakening and um, never saw the world the same way again after that. So.
That is exactly my story. That is why the podcast was originally called Searching for Political Identity. It all started with studying critical race theory in law school. Totally, it was a long process, but ultimately, when you look back on it, it was a red pill moment. So you said something interesting, constitutional principles. People on the left, it kind of blows their mind when people like you and I, formerly on their side, say to them, hey, look, Trump, believe it or not, is the better guy for the Constitution. They wonder how we can square that against the 2020 election challenge, January 6, 2021. Some of his more, you could call them draconian moves, his boldest moves. And it's kind of difficult to kind of say to them, hey, look, I understand, at least for me, I understand the concerns, but I weighed them in the wider context. And believe it or not, he's the guy that I thought is better for that role. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really challenging one because the people on the left have gotten, in my opinion, so far away from what our actual constitutional values are and what the vision of this country our founders had was. And so I'm not even sure that many of them, if, this is a question that I ask um, a lot of times to people is like, what does freedom mean to you? And it's a really interesting question when you are trying to get an answer to that question from a lot of the people I think on the left. I think the other thing is that, and I believe that this has been purposefully done, is that we no longer have common definitions of so many words. Like, what is a right? What do you have a right to? And
Hmm.
where do those rights originate? And I think that's where we see a lot on the left. That are really far from the Constitution. And I give that as background to say that, there are a lot of things you could point to and say that, you could try to, in my opinion, maybe spin that Trump is going against the Constitution. But in my opinion, things like um, questioning whether the results of an election are legitimate and then peacefully handing power over when you're supposed to is not violating the Constitution. I think that anyone should care about whether the citizens of this country believe that there is integrity in our electoral process. And someone raising questions about that um, isn't an attack on democracy. What it is an attempt to ensure that there is legitimacy behind the government. If too many of our citizens have questions and the government doesn't address them, that can be a really bad situation in terms of moving forward. So I think I can see where they are coming from. I think that they have lost sight of what our Constitution actually is, and that they have been, persuaded by propaganda and through censorship of other opinions, um, that things are happening, things that Trump has done or is doing are um, constitutionally invalid when they are not. And in fact, the courts have backed him up on a lot of the things that they would say are unconstitutional. So
Right. And you write about in this summary that you provided to me from this book. So the book is Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites, yes?
yes, that is the name of the book, and I know it's a pretty strong title. And I will say, as I already said, I find myself, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I don't know
Hmm.
exactly what I am. And I do think people on what we would consider both sides of the political spectrum are programmed. I just wrote this book from the perspective that I know, and that's the Democratic side, not the, Republican side. So.
So I guess take me back to the beginning of your awakening and kind of walk me through it.
Sure. So I was, so the listeners know, excuse me, I was a Democratic advocate and lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. I worked in a federal agency for a while. I worked in the United States Senate. I also worked for nonprofits and government contractors, kind of got to see the whole sort of DC swamp ecosystem from a lot of different angles, including administering a small political action committee. So I did get to see a little bit of the money side of the politics as well. And I think my awakening really started a little bit before COVID, although COVID was the aha moment. I unfortunately lost both of my parents to illness. My dad in 2014 and my mom in 2016, and had to interact a lot with what I now like to call our sick care system in this country, as opposed to our health care system, because it mainly manages symptoms. But that's a whole other conversation, and that's maybe a Maha conversation.
Right.
But that is part of what helped to wake me up. My dad had surgery and he had a bunch of catastrophic complications. Was essentially
Mm,
functionally quadriplegic with adrenal failure afterwards. And my mom, who
mm,
had multiple sclerosis, became his primary caregiver. And as a result of all the stress, including the financial stress they were under, she ended up being diagnosed with stage 4 of an extremely aggressive cancer that had spread everywhere. And was given the you should get your affairs in order. You may have only a few months to live speech by the doctor.
mhm,
And she said, I'm going to do traditional treatment, Lisa, but if there's anything else that I can do, I want to do it because I want to stick around. I want to
mhm,
live.
mm,
So I did, and she asked me to do research for her. So I
mm,
did, and I started looking into cancer treatment and what we know about what causes cancer and what we know about what can be helpful in treating it. And it really didn't jive, I will say, with what our government agencies tell us. So we got my mom
mm,
to a naturopath. We changed her diet. We changed everything she put in and on her body. We
mhm,
worked on addressing stress better. And she had surgery, and then she had started a round of chemo. And by the end of the third treatment, they ran a bunch of tests, and there was no evidence of cancer in her body anymore. And it was, the doctor said, that's a miracle. I've never seen this with this cancer.
mm,
And he, of course, had no idea why my mom was beating it when most people in her at her age, at that stage, with her condition, wouldn't be beating it. And so she remained cancer free completely for 2 years, by following, keeping, basically eliminating toxicity in her life and giving her body the nutrition that it needed to help keep a healthy immune system.
mm,
And then she got a tiny little growth back at the original site of the tumor, and the doctor immediately prescribed chemotherapy again. My mom had one treatment, and it fried her kidneys, and she died
mm,
of kidney failure. And her cause of death, of course, was cancer, not chemotherapy
mm,
poisoning. So this started a lot of things in my, questioning the agencies. And I should say too, I worked on disability policy for my 20 years in Washington. So I spent a lot of time working on health care and, advocated and lobbied to get the Affordable Care Act passed, for example. So I worked with these agencies a lot during my time there, and the people who worked at those agencies. And so it just kind of raised a lot of questions. For example, the nutrition information that I learned doing this research really couldn't square with our USDA food pyramid. It didn't make sense.
mhm,
And a lot of the things that our agencies were doing just didn't make sense. But I kind of had to pigeonhole that in the back of my brain because after my mom passed away in 2016, I went back to work with those very same agencies and those very same
Mm.
people. And so, but it had started to, as I like to say, create a dam or a crack in the dam of, that was keeping the flood of truth from me. And it just kind of held there until COVID happened. And then at the very beginning of COVID, I bought everything they were saying to us. I was afraid, really afraid, just like everyone. I thought, oh my goodness, here's the big one. I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to kill anyone's grandmother. So I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. But at the same time, the advice again that they were giving us just didn't make any sense from a health perspective, especially based on the research that I did for my mom. And this
Mm.
example is one that I can give that's really easy. Is that one of the things, if you remember way back, at the very beginning, unless you were an essential worker, you weren't allowed to leave your house. You were supposed to stay inside. Even if you
Mm.
had a yard, at least in DC where I lived, you couldn't leave your house. You had to stay inside. Um, and one of the best things you can do for your health is get sunshine and vitamin D. And so if I have a yard, I can't go out in it and get some of the best medicine that, the creator gave to us. I have to sit in my house and breathe recirculated air and all the chlorine that you've told me to wipe all over everything to make
Mhm.
sure. So from a perspective of, the other thing I learned is that, oxygen, a lot of bacteria, cancer, they thrive in anaerobic environments. So the less oxygen you have, the better the environment for them to live and proliferate. So all of these things don't make any sense from that perspective. And then the censorship started, Brian, and that's,
Mhm.
I think, really the dam that broke, or the straw that broke the camel's back, because all these people who are supposedly uh, not smart, not educated, are asking
The
questions.
smelly Walmart shopping Trump supporters.
Yes, asking questions, and then they started censoring these natural health folks that
White
I,
supremacists, Christian nationalists, by the way,
of
of which there
course,
are some, small, very small, but the painting of the broad strokes was
the broad
terrible.
strokes. Yeah, I mean, the person who's going to eat the horse paste, right? That is so
Mhm.
stupid. So all of this is going on, and my partner at the time, he didn't buy any of the narrative around COVID from the beginning, and so he and I were going. His name's Jamie. He's still my partner, and he and I were going verbally sparring about things, and one day he said to me, he looked me right in the eyes, and I said to him, I said, Jamie, I can't believe it. I can't believe the agencies that I worked with all these years, the people that I worked with, would do this, that they would do this to our country, that they would do this to the world without data and evidence to support it, without the science behind it. And he looked me dead in the eyes and he said, Lisa, very calmly, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And the important part about that question really is that I
Mm.
already believe that they were poisoning our water because of fluoride, because of all of the pharmaceutical residue that's in municipal water treatment and all of that stuff. And water, as we all know, is like the most vital thing. We don't get it, we die pretty quickly. So if they would do that, what wouldn't they
Mm.
do to us? My brain could not think a way out of it. And one of the things I found for myself, and that a lot of people on the left seem to be able to do, is carry a great deal of cognitive dissonance, holding ideas that just really can't go together in their brain, especially if an expert, someone who is educated, someone who
Right.
has credentials, has told them both of those things. Who are they to question the expert? But this pushed my cognitive dissonance to the point where my brain could no longer hold it. And um, and then he put the icing on the cake and he said, if you don't believe me, prove me wrong. Show me the data and the evidence. Show me. And I said back to him, okay, I will. And then I started doing real research. I allowed myself to think for myself for the very first time, I believe, in a long time,
Mm,
and look at sources that I normally would have discounted, probably because they weren't those experts that I had been conditioned to only believe.
hmm.
And then I started, as they say, going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. And everything really I thought was true, I then thought was no longer true. And my life has never been the same.
Yeah, no, I get it in so many ways, and I think COVID almost it was so I don't want to say catastrophic, but so monumentally important to the political shifting landscape that we're experiencing now that you almost just kind of assume it's a given. You forget to even talk about it. But it was so important. And for me, I was in law school studying critical race theory. We come back to school with a mask on, and we're talking about how to divide the country further. In your case, you have this terrible medical situation with your parents. My condolences, by the way, and this experience with your partner, and that's a but sandwiched with COVID and the crackdown, the censorship response, just made everyone or so many people question. And so you write in the book about this censorship machine, between the media and just the entire apparatus that, except for Fox News, you're pretty much conditioned to take the left leaning view of things. So I guess my question is, when you started to pay attention and question narratives and really start looking, what did you see beyond the COVID stuff, beyond the healthcare stuff? What did you see when you started looking at the left with a fresh set of eyes?
What I saw was a very controlled set of people who were controlled through fear. And I think that's the basic way, it's the basic tool underneath all of the media, the censorship, all of the propaganda, is to get people to a place where they are afraid enough that they are willing to allow the government to control most aspects of their life, and it took me, I went, when I started, after I sort of put my brain back together and figured out some of my self-esteem again, and my identity was so tied up in being on the left, and I think that
Hmm.
is a change that we've seen significantly in the 21st century, is that people's identities are so tied up in their politics. I really don't think they used to be, and I would say that social media and the internet, and the constant news cycle, has a lot to do with that. But once I put myself back together and I started looking back to write the book, I can kind of look back to 9/11 and see how the environment of fear just
Hmm.
started to be created. And, I use this, I talk about this in the book, and I think it is a good example, is that I've always believed that there were three amendments in our Bill of Rights that really kept us a free people and made us somewhat different than many other countries.
One, two, and what's the other one?
It used to be four. It used to be the Fourth Amendment. But and that's why I bring it up in relation to 9/11, because essentially the Fourth Amendment died when the Patriot Act passed and the
Mhm.
Transportation Security Act passed,
Right, for the
which created,
audience, search and seizure, protection in your private spaces from government intrusion
yeah, without a warrant and
without a warrant.
probable cause. Yeah. And so, we started conditioning people to allow the government to search us with absolutely no reason when we go to the airport. And we'll take our shoes off, as a matter of fact. And we can bring liquid, but only if it's under 3 ounces, because you can't make any explosive with 1 ounce of five different kinds of liquid. And
Mhm.
just so everyone knows, I no violence and no bombs,
You're not
but
a
what I'm
bomb maker?
saying, no, I'm not. But
Okay,
what I
good.
am saying is that it really made people completely forget the Fourth Amendment.
Mhm.
And you combine that with, things like the launch of Facebook. I've always found it fascinating how people, I don't think young people who, I mean, and maybe you can speak to this. You're younger than I am, but you're not, as when I say, like a 18-year-old today,
Yeah.
has any sense of privacy. They post
Right.
everything they
Right.
do online and no understanding of why that might be important or why it should
Hmm.
matter.
Right.
Um, and so, as I say that, I see that the way that they um, made that happen, as a lawyer as well, that the drug war started to chip away at the Fourth Amendment with things like the good faith exception to the exclusionary rule of evidence.
Mm.
And things like that. And I was really upset about that before because, obviously, the whole idea behind the Fourth Amendment is that you're supposed to have privacy. The government needs to have a reason to get into your business, and now it's just sort of an assumption I think that people make that the government has a right to know all of these things, and it shows how clearly they can use fear to get people to give up their basic fundamental natural born God given rights that our
Mm.
founders were smart enough to enshrine in our Bill of Rights. But with the Fourth Amendment gone, that puts a lot of pressure on the Second and the First
Mm.
in order to keep us free. And when but they started using fear once again to almost completely eviscerate the First Amendment. And I think when I started hearing the word disinformation come out of our elected leaders towards our own citizens, it really
Mm.
sent a chill down my spine because that is not a word that the government uses against its citizens in a free republic. It really isn't.
Yeah, it's such a good point to connect it to 9/11. I guess the broader point is we're living in such different times, um, whether you want to make the assumption that it's tied to some greater plan or conspiracy, or it's just this fascinating and kind of depressing slide historically away from freedom. We are living in very different times, certainly than our founders imagined, and it just keeps changing. I mean, that's how technology works. And so I've always been interested in the relationship between technology and government. And on the one hand, you think, oh, the Constitution should remain and it shouldn't really matter. On the other hand, you want to be three dimensional about it and say, like, you know, how is life changing, and what is the relationship between people and government? And it's great to entertain those questions. I do all the time, but I'm certainly with you at this time still certainly not ready to depart from what I learned in grade school, which was our rights come from our creator, and it's not theocratic, but it's very important to keep that in mind. In fact,
No, yeah,
go
and
ahead. Yeah.
I think it is just to add to that because cede the once you cede the power to decide what rights you have to the government, then none of your rights are safe. And that's why I think it's important. People say, "Well, healthcare is a right, should be a right." Well, what
Mm.
does that actually mean? How do you effectuate that? Who gets to decide what
Hmm.
healthcare is and how much healthcare? And then
Mm.
it's not really a right, right? It's a privilege. It's because the government said you have it, and then and another
Right.
government that you may not agree with could then take it away. And so
Mm.
I think, and for me, and this is really hard for a lot of people, and I think the left has really lost sight of this. Freedom of speech is an absolute. Obviously, the court has said you can't run into a crowded theater and yell fire because that would immediately have, the government can regulate that and not run afoul of the First Amendment.
Hmm.
But beyond that, um, it protects the most heinous speech just as it protects the most lovely speech. And it's not there for when things are easy, it's there for when things are hard and when government is abusing our rights and when government needs to be held to account. And so, and that's a really hard place for a lot of people to be. But I will relate the story, which I do tell in the book as well. When I found out that the ACLU had defended the rights of the Nazi Party to march in Skokie in the 1970s, Skokie, Illinois, which is a town in Illinois where I grew up in Illinois. And
Hmm.
I didn't grow up in Skokie, but I grew up in Illinois. And there are a lot of Jewish people who live around Skokie. And so I was appalled at the ACLU, which is an organization I used to be a member of, but I no longer am or would be, given some of the positions they've taken lately. But and my parents stopped and said to me, Lisa, your right to speak freely is only as secure as the right of someone whose positions you abhor. And so you have to allow even literal Nazis to speak,
Hmm.
or the First Amendment is getting chipped away at. And so this stuck with me.
Hmm.
I will say too, I'm really a First Amendment absolutist, because it's not just freedom of speech, it's freedom of assembly, it's freedom of association, it's freedom
Hmm.
to practice our religion when and where we want. And all of those rights were eviscerated during COVID, without so much as a conversation about it. And again, it was fear. It was fear used to manipulate and persuade people to be willing to give up their natural born rights, and in many cases, literally turn their neighbor in if they were violating some of the more egregious provisions. I talked to someone who said that his neighbor actually called the police on him when he went for a walk at midnight and nobody else was out on the street
Holy shit.
during the
Thought this was
lockdowns.
America.
Yeah, I thought it was too, but so I think that was really, for me, that was it's a hard one, and it's one where, that is where I firmly came down. When the Biden administration, and I keep forgetting what the name was, but they wanted to create the disinformation office. Nina Jankowicz was her name. I can't remember
Mm.
what they were calling it. And I said, this is literally a ministry of truth straight out of George Orwell's 1984. And this is the
Right.
Democrats who are doing it.
Hmm.
Um, this would be part of what my answer back to those Democrats who asked me, how could you vote for
Right.
Trump,
Exactly.
would be is he's not the one creating a ministry of truth. He's not the one,
Right.
um, with a direct line to Facebook telling them to censor people. He's not
Hmm.
the one, same thing at Twitter. He wasn't the one doing that. It was the
Right.
Democrats.
Yeah. No. I think of myself as a MAGA liberal now, and as you describe it, I think it can be easily shown that the MAGA movement is in so many ways really just a return to liberalism, whereas the left has really rejected it and taken this more authoritative bent where the rights are privileges. And so while there is a very small contingent of um, white supremacist, vibey, Christian nationalists, people who view this thing as satanic versus godliness, which, I'm open to that discussion. I had it last week with my previous guest. But however far you want to take this thing, there is this interplay between authority and freedom. And to me, MAGA just seems to be more on the side of freedom. And I think I think the vast majority of MAGA are liberals, and so the media has painted them as rubes, as you write about, and as people for whom we should have contempt and no respect. They're not credentialed, they're not educated, but they know the Constitution. They get the basic idea here, and I think they've got it right. And so it's kind of crazy. You don't want to assume the worst about your government, but some of us along the way start to look at things and go, you know what? This doesn't jive with the freedom that I grew up with.
I think that that's 100% true. I think also that, I would consider myself a classical liberal, but also a conservative, and then I want to conserve our Constitution and the
Right.
constitutional values in it. And I do think that at some point there is good and evil coming into this. I am, and However, different people are gonna look at that differently.
Hmm.
I think, but I also think, the full title of the book, Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites, the second part of it is about our very education system and how it has really indoctrinated so many people away from the Constitution and away from those values. Like you say, critical race theory in law school. And, I think it's fair to have conversations about race and discrimination, but it is not, you don't solve discrimination with discrimination, and you don't
Hmm.
violate the 14th Amendment, equal protection, in order to right some supposed wrongs. And at the core of critical race theory is critical theory, which is about deconstructing the entire country and replacing it with a radical left, communist, socialist type of
100%
government,
correct.
which is always gets left out of the conversation generally. Is, well, what is the end goal of this,
Right.
and I spent a fair amount of time talking about how we kind of switched from the goal of equality and equality of opportunity
Yep.
to sort of equity, which first of all is almost impossible to define.
Hmm.
And I think maybe in the book, I have maybe 8 different definitions of equity, none of which are the same, and all of which are completely subjective. So that,
Right.
have we reached equity yet? I don't know. And who gets to decide? And but the point being that we never sort of push the conversation to its logical end, that you have to sort of eliminate meritocracy as part of an equity conversation. I use this example. I'm 5'3". I'm never going to be a good player in the WNBA, because that's what my natural skills and talents don't lead, to that. And it should be okay that I'm not going to do that.
Right.
It's not equitable, but we're not born all the same. And like I say, the end discussion never happens of, well, how do we get to this equity? Well, it involves taking things from some people who have earned it and giving it
Exactly.
to people who have not. Um, and who gets to decide that, and how that ends up, is never part of the conversation.
Right. Yeah, no, equity. Well, the equal protection clause, the idea behind it is that similarly situated people shall be treated the same. And so, by basically, you have to have the idea that black people, white people, Indian people, Jewish people, Asian people, they're not the same. And it's one thing to say that there are cultures and you have to do this assimilation calculation and the melting pot. And, it's a fascinating conversation about what is American society and what is the dominant culture. And that's okay. But for me, at the end of the day, I just think the melting pot is good. You should assimilate into it. And whether you want to acknowledge that the base of that melting pot, it came from a white culture, it didn't come from Africa, it didn't come from Asia, okay, fine. There's nothing wrong with the history of the culture and how it became improved over time with contributions from outsiders, but still maintained its core function. Equity, yeah, wanting to dismantle it as opposed to play within that framework, and that's what it's all about.
I 100% agree, and I think that the schools have been used, especially higher education. Although I see it throughout middle, younger classes now, as
Absolutely.
well.
That was one of the things that I had trouble with when people said, "You're learning it in law school and that's appropriate there." And I said, "You're right. I signed up for it and it's in law school. I can handle this." But when I looked around, I saw it everywhere.
Well, I mean, this is an example. A recent podcast I did maybe a month ago, someone told me that his 15-year-old son, for Thanksgiving, their project was going to be holding a trial against Christopher Columbus for genocide.
Wow, man.
Yeah. So, and of course, he said, I told my son he's going to defend Christopher Columbus in this trial, and I will help him with that.
Nice.
But there weren't a lot of kids signing up to be on his defense team with him, and so that all of this critical
Wow.
theory has siphoned down into our grade schools because it's being taught to the teachers who are teaching these children, and it's taken a couple of generations.
Hmm.
The other one that I think is really concerning is the treatment of free speech and the way that has is being portrayed to children, and I think we saw this happen, with the left's reaction to the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, where I've seen many reactions where people said his speech was violent. What he said was violent against me, or against people like me, or against vulnerable
Trans,
populations.
obviously trans reference.
Trans, but I think for that, and but it's also, he had some pretty strong words sometimes taken out of context about race and taken out of
Affirmative action and stuff
affirmative
like that.
action and things like
Yeah.
that. But the idea that that saying something is violence that
Right.
justifies killing another human being is
Right.
a pretty scary place to be. And I found out that now in school they no longer teach the saying often, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. The saying has been changed to sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will last forever.
Wow. That's a total inversion.
Correct. Yeah. So I think,
Hmm.
I focus a lot of time on higher education in the book talking about it, but I think that the indoctrination begins at a very young age now, and the trans issue I think is a perfect example of that. And it's beyond just wanting to limit people's speech now. It's about compelling their speech too, and that gets at the very basis of if you can no longer speak your mind, then your mind is no longer free. And I think in 2023 there was a study or a poll that was done, and nearly 50% of Democrats between the age of 18 and 29 thought it should be a crime to misgender someone.
Mm. Yeah. When you say speech is violence, which there are the law accounts for certain situations, such as fire in a theater, where it becomes more than just mere speech, and that's okay. But when you call speech violence, you're necessarily taking it off the table. You're removing it from the lexicon, and that has cascading effects in society. And so it's a real threat. And so let's take for with Charlie Kirk, for example, let's take for granted that he was controversial at times, that he was not always perfectly uh, respectful, even though he was for. I mean, I have great respect for Charlie Kirk from what I know of him, but let's give it an assumption that he was occasionally uh, kind of playing in this war of words in the ideological battlefield. That to call that violence is really tough because the issues are serious. You want to be respectful of trans people and their realities and their existence, and give them dignity. But these are controversial topics, and to say that talking about them is violence is problematic.
I completely agree with that. And, I didn't know Charlie Kirk personally, but I have seen a lot of his conversations. And, I never saw him, if you looked at an entire interaction that he had with someone, I never saw him be
Super
disrespectful
respectful.
or
Yeah.
rude or and one of the things that I think you could see if you watched him speak is he was always searching for what he had in common with the person he was talking to. He always looked for how can I find a point of agreement so that we can connect as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
um, And I think that the trans issue, gender ideology, is really hard for me because I respect an adult's right to do whatever they want. I respect their right to love who they're going to love, to dress how they want, to do all of those things.
Hmm.
Um, but it is one where they need to respect my beliefs and my rights as well. And that
Hmm.
can include believing for scientific or religious reasons that there are just two genders, man and woman. They correspond with birth sex, and I believe that that can't change. So it's challenging for me. And then I also think that it has been used to serve as a wedge issue between children and their parents. One of the goals of critical theory, which is Marxist in its origin, and Marxism is just destruction of the nuclear family and
Hmm.
destruction of religion. Because those are the two institutions that people can have faith in and get comfort and strength from, that would prevent them from
I'm relying.
on the government, correct, and on the party, the Communist Party. So, um, I
Okay. Yeah, again, to just share a little bit more with you and the audience about the experience I had for my journey. Speaking of Justice Jackson, I was studying CRT when Ted Cruz, first of all, the first class I took in that subject was when Ron DeSantis was running and was all in the national news and he was sparring with Newsom. And actually, even deeper on that, I attended through the company I work for, and I'm happy to do this. We attend the Victory Fund. It's an LGBTQ fundraising political thing. I went. It's nice. Okay, it's fine. I respect everybody. Newsom was actually there, and he gave a nice stump speech, a very talented stump speech against DeSantis. Not that I was really in his corner at the time, but I was in the process of kind of going through this transition, for lack of a better term. And then in the second semester, taking the second class, is when Ted Cruz was grilling and having these conversations with Jackson. They went to Harvard, I think, together, Harvard Law. So that was so fascinating. I'm in law school taking these classes, and she's saying, "What is a woman?" And it's just like, where are we? Like, I just went through law school. I thought this was supposed to be a high level, conversation about originalism or a living constitution or what have you. And here we can't even define what a woman is. And I'm not trying to be dismissive or disrespectful of trans identities, but it's just like, wow, we need to take a minute here and say, where are we? It's confusing. Even if you say we're wrong and the trans movement is completely authentic and genuine and we need to accept, it's like, even if you go there, you say you got to give people grace. It's just a very divisive time.
it is a very divisive time. I think it is also the case that it's part of the point, creating confusion, removing the meaning of words so that you look to the government to tell you what is true.
Hmm.
And it is. So I think it is very confusing. And again, I respect the right of an adult to do whatever they want, and um, but they don't get to require me to do it with them. And part of what I
Hmm.
that's my First Amendment right. It's my right as a free thinking individual to
Hmm.
believe what I want to believe.
Hmm.
I believe, anyway. And but part of what I also did when I was writing the book, because obviously this was a big issue in the years between COVID and now, the gender ideology, was do a lot of research, kind of looking into, well, what studies are we relying on for the standard of care, and um, all of those kind of things, and let me take a look at are there studies that show giving transsex or transgender hormones are safe? And the truth is there really aren't. There's no studies on
Mm,
long-term studies on puberty blockers for
right.
youth. There's no studies on testosterone for women, biological women, and what that does in the long term. And as part of this, I found out they actually never really did any long term studies on the birth control pill for women before
Mm,
putting it into it. And is that part of why so many women are depressed and on antidepressants because
right.
we've messed with their hormonal balance their entire life? And then, where are the studies that show that so-called gender affirming care actually results in better outcomes for trans youth? And the truth is that there are some studies, but they're very bad quality, very small sample sizes, and also almost exclusively on self-report. So if someone has transitioned, they're gonna, probably report a positive bias. But now we're starting to see a lot of detransitioners, right? And talking about how it really didn't help me at all. And, now in many cases they have irreversible effects of the
Yeah.
transitioning. And so, I think part of why I wanted to bring that up is that there is an assumption, I want to know, why are so many young people feeling so bad, feeling so like, why do we have such a mental health situation with young people feeling so disconnected, feeling part of if you listen to detransitioners like Chloe Cole, she talks about how she found a community online that accepted her and that she
Mm,
went there for acceptance. And I think that's a big part of what is happening, and but let's ask the question of, why do we find ourselves here, and what can we do for children to help them feel more okay with who they are,
mm.
as opposed to rejecting like a fundamental piece of who they are, and what is that all really about, and I think we used to call that, we used to call gender dysphoria a mental illness up until very recently.
Right.
And I think that we have some pretty significant mental health concerns going on with young people in this country and older people in this country, as a matter of fact. And let's have a real conversation about that and what's causing that and how can we help address it. Like, for example, rebuilding community, rebuilding institutions, with small institutions within communities
Hmm.
that help people feel connected to one another, and help people see positivity in real life that I think is often lacking these days for people.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that we have a mental health crisis in this country, and it's hard. Sometimes you wonder, like, is there an overall scheme at play here? Is this on? It's hard not to think, like, God, this has to be intentional. We are destroying ourselves. We are forgetting who we are. We are weakening ourselves. And what's the next step? Who's going to invade us? Who's going to? Is it going to be a explicit invasion? Will it just be rotting from within? You can go any way you'd like with it, but and you don't, again, you don't want to dismiss people. You don't want to dismiss the idea that we can learn new things about the human condition, right? You don't want to be totally off limits, but it's very obvious that we have a mental health crisis, and it seems certainly plausible that gender dysphoria could be a symptom of that and not its own issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there may be several things contributing to it. I think that, the phytoestrogens and the food, and our food is not helping things. I think, I believe there's a piece of it that's what they call the social contagion model, which is what I was
Hmm.
referring to in terms of technology, and finding an online community that will accept you. But I think we also need to have a realistic conversation about the impact that technology is having on our mental health. I think the world has never been the same after COVID. at least America. I haven't
Hmm.
done a lot of traveling to see the world, but I at least the people around me seem different. Children especially seem different. And they had to, for example, uh, change all of the developmental marker dates for children
Hmm.
because no one was reaching them. None of the children were, because a big part of developing as a child is seeing someone else talk and learning facial expressions. And so when
Mm.
you mask them, and then you also had kids were not going to daycare and they weren't going to kindergarten, and so they weren't interacting with others in the same way. And it really pushed us all away from whatever activities we had in our life that were in real life, away from those,
Hmm.
and more online. And at a very basic level, all this blue light is not healthy for us, like,
Right.
but beyond that, and I'm not a Luddite. I'm happy that I can have this conversation with
Right.
you all the way across the country. And I would never have woken up without the ability to do the research that technology allowed me to do, to see through the narrative, to go
Hmm.
under or around the propaganda and the censorship, to see truth. At the same time, we as humans, I think, need to be connected to each other, to something bigger than ourselves.
Hmm.
And as we put more and more of our attention and our faith into our screen in front of us as opposed to our community and those around us, it also makes it easier to control us through fear. And the algorithms that social media uses, but also Google, for example, uses to figure out searches, suppressing certain results and highlighting other results, which end up painting a picture for us that I think is designed to make us feel angry and isolated and afraid.
Hmm.
And that makes it much easier to other people, to make them the bad guy, to make them, not, and to keep us fighting each other, left versus right, man versus woman, gay versus straight, LGBTQ not versus not, black versus white, as opposed to thinking about what we have in common as humans and what foundational values can
Hmm.
we share as Americans. And therefore, it takes our attention away from what the government is doing, and puts it in a negative light on our fellow citizens.
Yeah, it's just the siloing of people, whether it's malicious or not. It's just by definition, hey, you're interested in this, you're interested in this. It's the sorting and siloing and categorizing. And it can be easy to forget what unites us and what's important. And so technology is such a double edged sword. I mean, the libertarians, the view is if you decentralize it, it can be magical. But if you centralize it, and it can be just horrific. So I guess, whoa, excuse me. Hello, I got very excited. What what would you recommend for people who are not awake or are curious but don't see things the way you do yet? What can they do to kind of start giving themselves an opportunity to crack the code?
Well, the first thing that I would say is to let themselves ask questions again. If they are part of the way that I think you get controlled on the left is that you can't question basic things. You don't question experts. And so you just go along with what is told to you. Let yourself feel okay to ask some questions. And I have two sort of sayings that I think helped me once I woke up and to continue that journey. Question everything and follow the money.
Mm.
And I think once you start looking at, if you ask yourself, who funded this, who benefited from that funding, and where did that money go, you begin to see the world in a very different light. And I think the results from Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and what was revealed about USAID and where all that money was actually going is a good example of that. But let yourself ask questions and allow yourself the freedom to talk to people who you don't agree with, and try to do it with the most open mind that you can. Because I think if you're starting to ask questions at all, that's a really good sign that you're seeing something
Mm.
that is wrong. You're seeing one of the things I think that education does repeatedly is, you get you get a good grade by regurgitating back what was said to you, and if you stray too far from that, then you probably won't get a good grade, right? And so now why did I bring in education? Okay, so
How to wake up, how to
how to wake up.
reprogram.
Yeah. So part of what that does is it dulls your intuition. It makes you disregard your gut. If something doesn't quite feel right to you, trust that. Start trusting that again.
Mm.
I think that if you start looking at all with an open mind and you try a search engine that's not Google. That's another thing I would highly recommend. Try a search engine that's not Google, because Google, was directly created by our intelligence agencies through the funding for it was, and most everything on the internet is. I won't recommend a specific search engine because I've had to switch multiple times, because by the time I tell you this, the one that I'm using today may no longer be good. So do some research on your own. Search out independent journalists,
Mhm.
and use discernment, though, because not all of them are good. Not all of them are going to be telling you truth, but be open to them as much as you would be the New York Times,
Right.
and then look underneath what you see in the mainstream media, you know, um, because it's very clear that they are not. It's not independent. The mainstream media. It's not. Independent at all. And I have a lot on the history of actually media and Project Mockingbird, or I'm sorry, Operation Mockingbird. Um, if anyone hasn't heard of that, I'd say start there and look at Operation
Right.
Mockingbird. It's out in the public. There was
Hmm.
the church hearings in the 70s about it. It never went away. And it may open your eyes to think, maybe what the mainstream media is telling me isn't true. The other thing that I would really urge people to do is get offline and go talk to actual people who think differently than you in person.
Hmm.
It's a lot harder to hate someone outright when they're standing right in front of you. And it's also a lot harder to stereotype them when they are not fitting the stereotype. Um, and again, uh, it's not an easy process, and it's going to be different waking up for each and every person who does it, because each of us were brainwashed or
Hmm.
programmed differently, and each of us have different issues that we sincerely care about. For me, it was the First Amendment, and understanding through my legal training, through my upbringing, through everything, that if we lose the right to speak freely and move about freely, we are not free people. And I
Hmm.
cannot
Hmm.
be on the same team, so to speak, with the people who are in favor of eviscerating that God given right that we have to think what we want, to speak how we want, to move how we want. And so, but that's not going to speak to every person, and
Hmm.
so you need to figure that out. And that's the thing I would give advice also to people who are trying to help someone wake up is start with what they care about,
Hmm.
figure, and then don't try to tell them anything. Ask them a lot of questions,
Mm.
Brian. The Socratic method. And those questions shouldn't include facts or data that they're going to outright dismiss because it doesn't come from a credentialed source, an expert. And they shouldn't presume an answer. Um, and so, using a couple of examples that we've already talked about, if you know that freedom matters to them, ask them what freedom means to them. Ask them,
Hmm.
and it does a few things. It starts from a place of respect. I respect you. I respect your opinion. I'm really trying to understand where you're coming from. And then, the next question is, oh, well, is freedom of speech important to you? Is freedom important to you? Well, what does freedom of speech actually mean to you?
Hmm.
Oftentimes, there's not a lot of thinking underneath the top line talking points because that's part of what the programming
Hmm.
that I refer to does. And you may get called a name, you may get called an ism or a phobia, which is often what happens when you get to a point where they can't answer the question. Uh, View that as a badge of honor. Don't take it personally and know that you may be getting through a little bit because now they can't answer you, but you've started some wheels turning maybe in their brain. If you're trying to talk to someone maybe about gender ideology, my favorite question there would be, can you point out the studies that you're relying on, the data and the evidence, to show that gender affirming care helps?
Right. Boom.
So again, you're not telling them they're wrong, you're not, telling them they're stupid or any of that, but you're really trying to push them to think
Right.
again. That's all.
Right. Amazing. Yeah. No, in this world where it's so hard to know, I often say it's so hard to be an informed citizen these days. It's all the media, all the ideas, all the characters, all the deception. It's really freaking hard. And I guess it boils down to doing the work. And you're a good example of that. You've done more work than I have. I mean, I had my experience and I interview people and I like what they say and I go with them basically. But you've done research and so you're giving us a real roadmap here to discover it's so I don't want to say discover the truth, but to question again and to give yourself an opportunity to make the decision for yourself on what the truth is in this difficult time, a confusing time with all these narratives and all these inputs. It's hard, isn't it?
It's really hard, and I often say, I can't tell you what's true. I can tell you a lot of things that aren't, once I look into them, and I don't think anyone else should be telling you what's true. I think each of us is capable of figuring that out for ourselves. And I want to live in a society where we have that right. We have that natural born, God given right to make up our own minds. And I'm a firm believer, I was a debater in high school, a debater in college, and I was a lawyer. And I am a firm believer that if you have the data and you have the evidence and you have uh, principles that you have thought about and understand and can defend, you should never be afraid of open and honest dialogue.
Right.
Um, and the biggest thing is, the opening line of the prologue of my book is admitting you're wrong is never easy, and admitting
Hmm.
you're wrong about everything is next to impossible.
Right.
But you have to be open to that possibility that you're wrong. And you have to be
Right.
okay with that. And you have to be
Right.
able to say, you know what? It's more important for me to know the truth and to follow the truth than it is for me to be right.
It's a
Um,
humility.
it is, and there isn't a lot of humility on the left, I hate to say. It's a very
Right.
elitist, very moral superiority
Right.
view. And so, and I'm not saying that doesn't exist on the right also, it's just not where I come from. It's a different perspective. But it is that very thing that being that's the other thing I would say is like know that it is okay to be wrong. It is
Hmm.
okay to be wrong, and once you let go of that, it's very freeing. It's great to have a free mind again. I will say it's also kind of scary because, as you say, it's a really challenging time to know what is true, to know what is real, um,
Hmm.
to know who the good guys are, if there are any
Yeah.
of those, in our political system right now, to know who they are, and so. I think, though, we all have somewhat of a duty to our republic to do the best job that we can figuring those things out, and never ceding to any authority the right to determine what is true.
Right. And at the end of the day, not everyone wants to preserve the republic, the constitutional republican model. So there's that. There are people who see things clearly, who are not confused, who do actively want. So, and that maybe that's just politics. I don't know, but it feels intense. And so these feel like intense times, whether you have age of disclosure documentaries coming out, you have all these, communist ideologies really latching onto the mainstream institutions, and everyone is just fighting each other and arguing, and AI, it is just really something. And I don't know. I came out of studying law school really proud of the American system we have and thinking it's great. And it's not my way or the highway, but it's not your way either. It's the American way. And we can work together. We can have the free exchange of ideas. And as long as there's respect for the institutions and for each other, even if there's serious disagreements, at the end of the day, it'll work out to something reasonable. But there has to be a give and take. And from the left, I think we see too much taking.
I would agree with that, and I also think that, you know I would love to see us having some conversations about restoring more of our federalist system back to our founders' vision.
Right.
I think, to be clear, this wouldn't you couldn't do anything that would violate the Constitution. But if a state like New York wants to have a less capitalistic vision,
Hmm.
they should be able to do that, but it shouldn't impact other states. I mean, our founders looked at states as a sort of laboratories of innovation, and it was almost like we would have, at this point, since we have 50 states, 50 different countries that,
Right.
join together for military strength and economic power and those kind of things. But beyond that, each state had its own constitution, and each state would have its own rules,
Right.
and we've gotten so far away from that,
So far.
so far, to the idea that this group of 535 elected individuals in Washington should be able to determine, down to the fact that, if I live out here on a farm in Virginia and my neighbor has a dairy farm and I want to buy raw milk from it, the federal government says I can't,
Right. It's the
which
structure
is
of the government, it's the ideologies, it's the technology, it's the lack of religion. All of it is we are just not, and that's life, I guess. We're not in the past. We're not living in the past. And so what are we going to make of this present? What are we going to build for our future? That is what we're talking about. That's why you and I are doing this kind of work. We just want to make a positive impact. Am I right?
100%. I want, my partner's grandchildren to be able to enjoy the country that I grew up in. It's not going to be the same country, but I want them to be able to have a country
Thematically.
that has the same principles, that thematically, yes, is still the shining, city on the hill, the beacon of freedom that it had been in the past. And I want to see my biggest goal is just that people, who disagree, about everything politically, can have conversations that are as respectful and as genuine as the conversation you and I are having, even though we don't disagree. Um,
Right.
and where, people stop looking at their fellow Americans who they don't politically agree with as being, having some sort of moral failing, as
Exactly.
opposed to, just a difference of opinion, where we can start from a place of respect, where we believe that, I want the best for every American just as much as you do. I just may not agree with you on how we get there.
100%. And I think you and I have made the calculation. Hey, when I look at the left and I look at the right, on the left, I see a much bigger population of people who have this view of the other side that they're a moral failure. And on the right, you have a much smaller fringe. The vast majority of the right seems to be these MAGA liberals who respect. But so the problem is bigger on the left, is what I, and maybe you as well, came to. And so this is where I am now. And all I want as well is to return to civility, remove the negative, toxic stuff, so that we can have an honest conversation between the genuine left and the genuine right, and see where we want to take this thing.
I agree. I think too, one of the things we all need to keep in mind is that I think there is a bigger problem on the left, in part because there are a lot of people who don't agree with some of the really radical parts of the left, but they don't feel like they can speak up about it because they will be
Mm,
canceled, they will be swatted, they will be
mm,
excommunicated from the left. And I think that um, social media and the internet make it seem like that on both sides, those fringe elements are much bigger than they actually are
right.
because the algorithms highlight those people again to
And they're
make
very
us
vocal, and they have very sharp words that go far online. So, yeah,
100%. And I think there are more and more people sort of like us. And, I think there are fewer and fewer people who are actually registered in either of these parties.
yeah,
And I think, people ask me often, should there be a third party? And I say yes, but I think what the third party has to be is sort of a constitutionalist liberal party
mm,
where it's more in the middle,
right,
actually. A
right,
lot of third parties are what you would say are on the far fringe. And so to help find a home for all the people who love the country and want to see our country preserved, and also are, you know, based in constitutional and natural born rights. So,
And is the libertarian, final question, is the Libertarian Party attractive to you?
there are a lot of things about the Libertarian Party that I do like. Actually, oddly enough, I my book launched the day of their 20 or the same day as their 2024 national convention. It was the first event I went to
Hmm.
for my book. Um, and I think, there are some ideas that a number of people in the party have that I think makes them really difficult for many people to adhere to. So, for example, the people who believe there shouldn't be any borders, we shouldn't have,
Right,
so, and that's
right.
kind of, I put them on sort of, they're too far on the fringe. For a lot of people, and I think they have I agree with a lot of their ideals. I agree,
Right.
with a lot, but I think that you'd have to address some of
They go so
those things.
far with the individualism. You can go too far.
Yeah, and I also think the other thing is that um, people are so unused to being free in this country now that we might
Mm,
need something interim, if you know what I'm
mm.
saying.
Yeah,
It's how do you
absolutely.
go from where we are to where we'd like to be? Um, I think the challenge is that no matter how we address the problems that we have, there's going to be some fallout, collateral damage. It's going to be hard to get from where we are to where we'd like to see ourselves. But the conversation can be about how do we minimize that? How do we best support a
Right,
transition back to
right.
freedom? And how do we help? I wish that I could say, here, if you just play this video, everyone will wake up,
Right.
but how do we help? I don't think it can be done that way. Programming gets done that way, and reprogramming can be done that way, but I'm talking about deprogramming and letting people think again.
Mm,
So it's very hard to do that on a mass scale.
right.
But I think that we can get there, but part of what our conversation should be is how do we minimize the negative impacts of moving away from the restricted freedom situation we
Ripping the
find
band-aid
ourselves
off
in.
and hurting ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. How do we do
Okay.
that?
Yeah. Amazing conversation. I actually do have one final question for you.
Sure.
You're Jewish?
By heritage, I do not practice any religion, but
Right. I'm Jewish by heritage. I didn't grow up particularly religious. I was bar mitzvahed. My wife, who I just got married to, thank you, is more
congrats.
religious. Thank you very much. So I I'm kind of leaning back into the identity a little bit more. I have family that is very much into the identity. So is this not an issue for you? This identity question because you're not really a practicer. Does it come up for you at all?
That really doesn't, I have my own faith and relationship with the creator, but I don't fit into a box with it, any box.
Yeah.
I 100% support everyone's right to practice their religion when and where they want to, and how it is. And I believe that one of the suggestions I give to people in the book is to explore your faith, because I do think that when you are when you have your faith and your belief in the creator, it's a lot harder to make you afraid and control you through that fear.
Right. Like Cat Williams said, I think on Club Shay Shay, it's like Shannon. What's his name? Is it Shannon Sharp's podcast? There was a big viral video they did, and Cat Williams said something like, "If it's just you, it's a cold world out there. But if you got God with you, it's a different story." So there's something to that, obviously.
And I 100% agree. And, I think that if you don't put your faith in God, you're going to put your faith somewhere. And if that ends up being the communist government, that's where it ends up being. So I think that returning to faith is one way in which it is really helpful, as if you're trying to free yourself, having God's acceptance, God's love
Right.
is
Power source.
yeah, and strength and a connection, and through that you will feel more connected to all your fellow humans, because
Right.
we're all God's children. So
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it's a deep subject and fascinating. Do you believe the alien thing?
so
Because I do.
I I can't again, I can't tell you what's true. I can tell you some things that aren't true. It is not true that we are alone in this universe. That I can
Right.
tell you.
Right.
But I what does that mean? I don't know. I think that there's a very good chance that we have been having interactions with uh, be they interstellar or interdimensional beings for a very long time, and our government has kept that from us.
Right.
And what that
Throw
means,
that into the mix.
yeah, well, it
Perfect. That's
does.
what we needed. Trump, COVID, aliens, AI, Marxism.
It's a crazy world out there. So, but I think the more that we have the conversations, the more that we openly discuss these things, the better. And if we can have, again, restoring respectful dialogue and starting from a place of what we share in common as opposed to what divides us, and reclaiming
Hmm.
our ability to make our decisions for ourselves, will live in a much happier, better society.
Well, amen to that, Lisa, and thank you for everything you're doing. And the book, from the summary you sent me, seems really tightly and well written. Seems like a really good read. So I'm going to go pick it up, and I encourage everyone to do the same. The title one more time is Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. Wow.
And you can find it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And if you want to learn a little bit more about me, you can check out my website, which is deprogrammingdemocrats.com.
Amazing. Well, I hope we've achieved that today on at least one or two people. And again, not reprogramming. I love how you said this, but deprogramming. Give the power back.
Reclaim your own mind.
Mm, amazing. Good stuff. Well, it's been a great conversation. You're exactly the type of person I wanted to talk to when I started this podcast, and I'm honored for your time. So thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Take care.